So Ben Symon is a paediatric emergency medicine physician, and he's also consultant lead in simulation. He's fascinated by the interactions and boundaries between how we interact together as clinicians and with our patients. I would very much like to welcome to the stage, for his keynote speech, Ben Symon.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for having me today. So my talk is very much about memory. I want to start today by talking to you about two memories from my own past, about my pediatric training. The first memory is from the very first day when I started training in peds, and the second memory is further down the track, right at the end after I'd finished. And I've got to tell you, memory number one is a very happy memory indeed. I've got to tell you, I remember that first day of peds so well because I was on cloud 9. I felt like Charlie with the golden ticket. I'd taken 2 years to get onto the program, and I was finally there. I grinned my way through corporate orientation. I was so happy. And Dr. Slaughter came down. He was the director of peds at the time. And he said a few things on that day that really stuck with me for the rest of my training. He said, "You'll never get in trouble if you call us overnight, but you might get in trouble if you don't." And he said something else. He said, the general peds team would love to hear from emergency if a patient of theirs that they see in clinic comes through ED, because they might like to touch base with that family and check in on them and see if there was anything that they could do to help. And I took a lot from that orientation about our values and what that means to us, but mostly what I took was, wow, this is my tribe. This is where I want to practice medicine. Because these people, they care about the kids more than their sleep or their time or their hierarchy. And they set boundaries to make that happen. And all through my training, I had a really good experience. And I just came to feel deep down that there's something special about pediatrics. I think that kindness is central to our specialty, and in a way that it isn't necessarily always the case in other places and other tribes. Memory number two is slightly more bittersweet, I guess, and I remember memory two for very different reasons. I remember it because it was a very ordinary day. So ordinary, in fact, that it was strange, because on that day for me, my relationships with my colleagues changed in ways that I couldn't necessarily fully control, in ways that were for a little bit the worse, and in ways that I've never really been able to fully claw back since that day that seemed so ordinary for me in every other way. I was working in an emergency department. I was seeing the same kind of kids that I normally see. I saw a 10-year-old boy who I felt needed admission, investigation, and an intervention. And so I called my colleague, and he was a good guy. We'd talked before, and we got on pretty well. But on that day, very quickly, I could hear this feeling coming down the phone line. There was this cynicism. It was thick, like fog, and I felt that I had to swim through it to get my story heard. Something had changed. I could feel like my story wasn't necessarily being listened to per se, it was being interrogated. It was being tested and probed. Someone was trying to find a weakness to try and prove that I didn't need to be heard and that this patient didn't need to be seen. And I kid you not, for me in that moment, on that very, very ordinary day, time just froze, just a little bit for a few seconds during that phone call. And I felt the world just kind of rotate, not heaps, just 10 degrees, because I knew what had changed. I hadn't changed, and he hadn't changed. We were both good people. But what had changed was my postcode. And I'd moved from working in a big tertiary service that had lots of resources to working in a smaller one that had less. And in that moment, I realized that I'd learned a lot of things, and I continued to learn them in the conversations after that. I learned that hospitals have immune systems to protect themselves against unnecessary referrals. And one of the primary neutrophils they have is shame. Shame to be calling, and shame for not knowing. I learned that kindness might be central to our specialty, but we treat it like a fairly precious resource. And we dole it out sparingly to those that we think deserve it, rather than necessarily those that we think need it, or those that we might run into in the corridor. And I think I learned something else that day, something that is both kind of disappointing, but also kind of a relief. I don't think we're that special in pediatrics. I think we're just like everybody else. I think we divide ourselves into groups of haves and have-nots, and ins and outs and different tribes. And then we start treating each other differently and assessing each other differently, and not necessarily being as kind as we think we are. And I think that's really tricky, and I think it's something that we need to work on. And I think that we're all actually complicit. I'd like to think I'm a kind guy, but when I work into my emergency department, I hear myself and my colleagues trash GPs for sending up patients, sometimes to that patient's face, when the GP has no right to reply. I go to medical handover and I hear the decisions of my colleagues being slammed with a lot of hindsight bias and no consideration to the volume of decisions we're having to make and the limited time that we have to make them. And I have seen, I gotta say, nurses who I adore tear each other apart over documentation and leave patients in corridors who need to be someone else so that they can make an administrative point. And if you doubt me, just grab a coffee cup and sit in a staff elevator and listen to the stories that you hear by the time you've reached the top floor. We're not always telling stories that lift each other up, and stories shape our culture. And I know that I was naive as a resident to think that we were all one big happy family, but I can't help but think that our patients would be safer and we would be happier if things worked more like the way I thought it did as a resident than what I know it does as a consultant. But I want to spend today thinking about something specific about that. I want to dig into why. Because when I look into this room, I see the faces of hundreds of people who I know and trust and respect, and who I know have given their lives to look after sick children. Something's gone wrong. We are kind as individuals. It's as a collective that we're sometimes found wanting. I don't think it's because we're nasty people, because I know that we're good people. And I don't think it's necessarily because we're under-resourced or because we're exhausted from a pandemic. I think it actually comes down to something very specific and something that we don't talk about a lot, something we don't think about a lot. I think it comes down to science, and specifically the science of where we store our memories. So, I'm just going to start inviting you to get to know each other a little bit, and just for the next 30 seconds or so, I'm going to ask you guys to turn to a colleague and share where you think you store your memories, and then I'm going to call you back really quickly. Go. You going okay? All right, I'm going to call everyone back. I'm going to be really tight. Okay, so we're just going to play a quick game of Family Feud, all right? So it's just going to be hands up. We're not going to do any internet polls. So who said that you store your memories in your brain or your hippocampus or something like that? Yep, 1, 2. Okay, great. We got lots of would-be neurologists in the audience. Fantastic. All right, who said their smartphone? You are my people. Thank you. Yes. So we store our knowledge on the internet and in our smartphones and in our photographs, yeah? Who said in a journal or a diary or family photographs? Oh, journals are not having a good time today. Thank you, Katie Reeves. There we go. And then lastly, did anyone say in each other? We got a few. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So there's a specific term for this. It's called transactive memory systems. And to me, it is the most beautiful and poetic, but also scientific theory I've ever read. Transactive memory systems is how we define how groups of people organize, encode, and retain knowledge. And Malcolm Gladwell, the podcaster and famous author, describes it a little bit more poetically. He describes it as the fact that we don't just store our knowledge in our minds or in paper or calendars or photos and things. We store our knowledge and our memories in the minds of the people that we love. And the reason that he says this is because he's quoting research from a guy called Professor Dan Wenger from Harvard. And he published a paper in the 1980s, this is not a new theory at all, where he studied couples who'd been in long-term relationships. And what he found is that when people have been in long-term loving relationships, they don't both try and remember everything about their lives. They distribute that knowledge between them in different ways so that they can each hold more. And in doing so, Dan Wenger was able to prove that by distributing their knowledge between them, these couples were able to remember more accurately than people who were interviewed alone. And in essence, by distributing their memories between them, they became more than the sum of their parts. So I'll give you a practical example. This is my mum and this is my dad. My mum is the center of the family. She knows the developmental stage of every grandkid and child who's come through her care. And if we want to know when my nephew Emerson started walking, we're going to ask mum. Yeah? We're not going to ask dad. That is not a useful investment of our time. Yeah? But if I'm at mum's house and she needs to connect to her Wi-Fi, I'm going to ask dad. And if I actually asked mum, she would literally just pick up the phone and pass me it with dad already on speed dial. Yeah? Mum does not retain that knowledge. That is not her responsibility in that relationship. Dad does the tech stuff, mum does the family stuff. And if we invited each of them to be assessed about their memory, we would consider them in deficit. But when we look at them as a whole and as a couple who trust each other and share knowledge between them, then they're whole. And this to me is just the most remarkable thing. And it doesn't just happen in couples, right? It happens in healthcare as well. And healthcare in many ways is the most incredible demonstration of transactive memory at work. Because when you think about it, there is just too much to know. Yeah? So we have to distribute it between different people. Yeah? So we store knowledge of the heart and we place that in the cardiology team. We store memories of what the pancreas does and we store that in the endocrine team. We store the knowledge of how to cut open a patient and fix what's physically wrong with them with surgeons. And we store the ability to look after a patient who's on the edge of death for hours at a time in ICU nurses. And we store the knowledge of how to screen through the haystack and find the needle of the one sick patient amongst the hundreds in our ED nurses. We store the knowledge of being able to connect families with the people that they need and the networks that can support them in social work. And we store the knowledge of where the hell anything is in the hospital, in our wardies and our AIN staff. Mm-hmm. And this, to me, this is the most remarkable thing. Yeah? When we think about ourselves, we are a network of knowledge. Thousands of people who have taken an unconscious agreement to distribute all of the knowledge we need to look after every sick kid who comes through any of our doors and make sure that we can connect so that the knowledge that child needs reaches them in time for them to heal. There is no species on this planet that has done anything like this to care for their young before. We are a miracle. But the very thing that holds us together and makes this possible is also the very thing that sometimes tears us apart. Because there's a problem. To organize that much knowledge, we have to form what Dan Wenger calls a meta-memory, a map of who knows what and where that's stored and how to access it. And in healthcare, we've done that through organizational structure. So we spread ourselves into teams and streams and specialties. And in doing so, we all acknowledge responsibility for different buckets of knowledge. But in doing so, the system kind of works. It works pretty well. It's a bit clunky, but it's sustainable as we rotate thousands of people through. But in doing so, we create a number of side effects that are unfortunate and unhelpful. The first is we sort people into buckets, and then they start to identify as that team rather than as part of the whole. Secondly, like attracts like. And so we start attracting the same type of people to the same group. And if anyone's read anything about internet forums lately, will know that that's not necessarily the most healthy idea. And then lastly, by necessity, we have to start forgetting the other buckets of knowledge. If we don't, we can't hold on to our own. But when we start to judge the competence of others, the only schematic we have left anymore is how much they know of our bucket and not how much they know of their own. And thus we start judging people unfairly for responsibilities of knowledge that they don't actually own. So there's another social phenomenon that describes this, and it's called social identity theory. And essentially, social identity theory is the idea that we define ourselves very much by what social group we think we belong to. And it's also how we define others and people who belong to other groups. And in doing so, we tend to be more charitable to the assessments of our own identity and our own subgroup, and less charitable and less forgiving to those of others. So to give you an example, I'm a physician, but I'm also a dad. It's my son and my partner. And so if I'm seeing an angry dad in ED, I've got two identities to choose from that I might associate with most. If I see myself as a dad, I might have more forgiveness for that person's particular behavior and be able to forge a better connection. If I see myself as a physician, I'm separating myself from that person, and I'm by definition going to be more judgmental and more angry about that situation than I need to be. So we identify by the social group that we belong to, and that helps us form a schematic of how to judge people. And the game is rigged. Which brings us back to our core problem. Yeah? So there's too much knowledge, so we store it in individual people. To organize the people, we have to organize them into teams. And to make those teams sustainable, we start forming tribes. And to build up our place in the tribe, we start slamming other tribes. And before we know it, we have coded this incredible network of knowledge with a fine patina of rust and mistrust. This is a serious problem. And how do we fix it? Well, the good news is we've actually fixed it before. So when COVID happened, I don't know about you, but in those first few months, something changed about healthcare for the better. We started changing the boundaries of how we saw ourselves and seeing ourselves more as one particular group. Something really fascinating happened at my work. The pediatricians started wearing scrubs. They didn't make a formal agreement, right? And if we asked them, they said, well, we want to be here to help, And that was a good thing and we appreciated it. But I think something else was happening as well. It was social signaling. We had changed how we saw each other, and in doing so, started to dress like each other. So if we can change the boundaries of our tribe, maybe we'll always be tribal, but maybe we can still work better together and make sure that the patients we see are getting the best care every time. So I've got 3 steps I think that will help. And the first is just to recognize and reflect. To acknowledge and understand any bias, we have to just accept that it exists. So I invite you today at some time during the conference or on the drive home, think about a time when you've judged someone unfairly because of where they are or who they are in medicine. And just accept it. Accept that it happened. Secondly, we have to remember our role. And by that, I do not mean our role as individual clinicians in healthcare. I mean our role within this incredible network of knowledge. We often think of knowledge and memory as something that we own and retain and use for the patient in front of us. But that's not actually the case. We also have a huge part of our job that is holding on to those memories that others have given us and lending them to others when they need. So if someone calls you and they're calling for help and they sound like they don't know what's going on, maybe they're not a fool. Maybe they're the genius who's realized that that knowledge isn't stored within them. It's stored within you. And they're trying to connect desperately that knowledge to their patient. We are not individual clinicians in healthcare. We are neurons. We are afferent and efferent vessels of knowledge, constantly transmitting data around this incredible system to make sure that the kids we look after have the best care. And if we can remember that, maybe we can embrace it. And maybe we can coat this network with humility and warmth, rather than judgment and coldness. Because warmth is a far better conductor. Finally, I think we need to reshape our stories, because stories are how we transmit and replicate culture. Do the stories that you tell in the corridor, in the tea room, lift your tribe up? Or do they celebrate others and make us more connected? I think this is a really important point, and over the next 3 days, we're on welcoming and neutral ground. So I invite us all to take up a few challenges. Go to a conference talk that isn't necessarily relevant to your particular part of the healthcare system, and see if it improves your understanding of the whole. Chat with a colleague over coffee that you wouldn't normally work with, and see if you can forge a connection. And most importantly, tell a story that gives tribute to another team about a time that they helped you or a patient that makes them look good. And then finally, please make sure to take those stories home, back to the floor, and start challenging the stories that we tell each other at work to make sure that we're connecting better. Because I think if we can chip away at this, if we can change the stories we tell, and if we can tell ourselves in moments of frustration, I hold knowledge for these people, but they also hold knowledge for me, then maybe, just maybe, we can start breaking open these boundaries of knowledge. Thank you. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you so much. Wow, that's just so much to take on. Do we have any questions from anyone in the audience who would like to pose a question? Or anything from Twitter? I know Andy's moderating our Twitter account down at the front there. Nothing from Twitter. Anyone in the audience? So I have a question, because your story about your referral really struck home to me, because we've all been there, haven't we?
Yeah.
And how do you think, tying that into all your experience around working across teams, working with other people, how do we, when we're in that situation, hold each other accountable while still being kind?
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky question, but also an important one. And I think we can hold each other accountable respectfully without perpetuating shame. And I also think that maybe sometimes a referral is not actually the time to start assessing each other. And I think a huge part of the referral process is often actually a process of assessment between two people and working out whether they can trust each other. And I think that potentially a respectful conversation can still be okay, but I also think it's really important to maintain the humility of recognizing that this person is being called for help. And I think sometimes it can be easy to forget that when people work regionally, or people work in smaller places, or they work in a place where they just don't have the privilege of seeing something every day, that they also hold a different type of knowledge for us, which is they hold the knowledge to work in that place with less capacity. They have the knowledge to work in a place that might be more challenging or less supported. And I think we have a responsibility to role model gratitude to that, and that maybe right now in that referral isn't the time to start assessing that person, but instead trying to really think, what is this person trying to say, and recentering it back on what is their concern about the patient, rather than what do I think about this person right now.
Wonderful, yeah. Putting ourselves in their shoes, seeing it through their lens.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
Ben, thank you so much.
No worries.
Thank you.